So the next type of connective tissue is blood being made in the bone marrow that's located in the gaps in spongy bone, so all these little gaps and spaces in between there. Blood is a fluid connective tissue, so although it's not like your other tissues that are solid structures, the blood, of course, is fluid. Its job is to transport cells as well as dissolve matter from place to place. So all the gaps where you have your plasma can actually have stuff dissolved into it. So as that blood travels through your tissue, parts of that fluid gets filtered out from the blood and be able to transport the dissolved nutrients to the tissues. So in blood, the ground substance is, again, plasma. So it's the kind of more space in between all your cells. The other part of blood are called your formed elements. So these are the solid structures within this blood tissue, connective tissue type. So you have three major categories of formed elements. You have your erythrocytes. These are your red blood cells. So their job is to transport oxygen mostly, and they also can transport carbon dioxide. Your leukocytes, which are your white blood cells, you don't have to know all of them this semester, but they're and I'm going to give it in a different order than here, neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So I need to just change that order, but kind of the way to remember those, at least for next semester, never let monkeys eat bananas. Okay, so the last formed elements are our platelets. They're not whole cells, they're actually fragments off of a cell. And these platelets, very small, and their job is to help with clotting of your blood vessels. So here in our little picture of the blood, so our most abundant cell are our red blood cells located all around this little picture. Here are white blood cells, so these are immune cells. They actually don't stay in blood that long. They actually end up going to move into either the lymphatic system or into the tissues to migrate around and detect pathogens. And then the platelets, of course, they stay. Okay, so done with the connective tissue, now moving on to our nervous and muscular tissues. So something that is common with both the nervous and muscular tissues is that they're both excitable tissues. So these tissues can be given a stimulus, and that stimulus is going to cause a response. So their ability to respond is by a difference in their membrane potential. So it's a gradient of charge across the cell membrane that allows those cells to have the response based on using that gradient that's already been set up. So membrane potential, again, is the electrical charge difference, so difference in gradients across that cell membrane. So in our nerve cells, that change in voltage allows it to makes a signal to other cells. In muscle cells, it causes the contraction or the shortening of the cell. Focusing on nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is specialized for communication. So either through an electrical means, traveling from one end of the cell to the other, and then switching to a chemical signal to signal the next cell in that pathway. So the cells that make up nervous tissue are our neurons. They're also called your nerve cells. So their job is to detect a stimuli. That stimuli gets converted inside the cell into a response, and then it's going to transmit that message onto the next cell in the process. The other type of cell in nervous tissue are called your neuroglia. They're actually more numerous than your neurons, so there's way more of them. Their job is to protect and assist the neurons, and they kind of work like as the housekeepers of the nervous system. So unfortunately, because they are small and we still don't really exactly know what exactly they do, we're still learning about them. But we do know a lot about our neurons. So for our neurons specifically have multiple parts that make up the cell. So here we have majority of the cell body, which is called the neurosoma. And extending off from the neurosoma, usually in a shorter cell extension than this other portion here that I'll talk about in a second, are your dendrites. So majority of the job of the dendrites is to receive signals from other cells. You also can receive signals on the neurosoma itself. And then the last part of a neuron is the axon. So we receive signals in the neurosoma as well as the dendrites, and then all of that gets received into the cell and eventually converting it into a signal for communication sent down the axon. And then at the end of the axon is the axon terminal, where that electrical signal gets converted into a chemical signal to send a ligand to the next cell to cause that next cell to respond and continue that communication. So for example, going from the motor cortex in the brain, sending a signal down from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, eventually getting into a particular part of your body where you want a muscle to move, sending that signal through this whole system. Eventually it'll reach that muscle so that you can cause it to contract and therefore cause the movement. Other job of your neurosoma is just basically to do most of your cell stuff. So make your proteins, and then they have to traffic them to your other parts of your cell. Also has your nucleus and majority of your organelles. So one thing that's special about your axons is they can be short, but a lot of times they should be very long, sometimes more than 1 meter long, because they're traveling long distances to send a signal to the next cell. Moving on to muscular tissue. So muscular tissue is specialized to contract or shorten in response to stimulation. So the job of muscular tissue is to exert a physical force. So once the muscular tissue contracts, it's going to pull on other tissues and cause movement. So when it does create movement, either does so with just your limbs or other parts of your body, helping with digestion, so the contracting muscles of your stomach, helping with waste elimination, so contractions of your intestines to move your feces down toward your rectum and anus, and eventually opening of the anus so that you can get rid of it. Helping with breathing, so helping to change pressure to allow for our gases to go into the body as well as move out the body. Speech, so air moving out the body as well as moving your lips and tongues and all the different parts of your mouth to cause your changes of the air, and which is detected as speech. And then lastly, part of blood circulation. So you have cardiac muscle that will pump out the blood. Your arteries have a little bit of muscular tissue. Some of your blood vessels, the openings of them are controlled by little small sphincter muscles. Next thing, your muscular tissue is important for body heat. So as your muscles are powered to move, some of that energy is lost as heat, which also helps to maintain your core body temperature. There are 3 types of muscular tissue. You have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So your skeletal muscle is attached to your skeletal system. Your cardiac muscle makes up your heart, and then your smooth muscle makes up your internal organs. So first type, our skeletal muscle, again attached to our skeletal system. One thing that's specific about our skeletal muscle is, one, the nuclei are pressed up against the cell membrane, because for our skeletal muscle, again, their major job for contraction and moving, allowing for the muscle fibers to work together so it pushes out the other things that it doesn't need out the way. Your skeletal muscle is also striated, so there's little stripes in the skeletal muscle due to overlapping fibers. And then lastly, your skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle tissue in your body that you have voluntary conscious control over. So your brain can consciously control your skeletal muscles and tell them to move. The other two tissue types you cannot control with your brain. So you have involuntary, unconscious control of them. So cardiac muscle is limited to the heart. Cells are branched and shorter than your skeletal muscles. So they also can like branch off into different directions. In between your cardiomyocytes or your cardiac muscle cells, there's called these intercalated discs. Do it up here. So that helps to join your cardiac muscle cells together. It also provides an electrical connection. So as your heart pumps, the signal is sent around the cells almost instantaneously, and so they'll contract together. It also provides a mechanical connection, so again, your heart's pumping all the time. So to keep the cells of this tissue together, your intercalated discs also help with this. Cardiac muscle is striated, so those overlapping bands help to cause that striping pattern inside the muscle. And your cardiac muscle, again, is, darn, you can't see it that well. Okay, striated, kind of can see it well. You have involuntary control, so your brain cannot consciously control your cardiac muscle movement. Last muscle type is smooth muscle. So this smooth muscle makes up the hollow organs inside your body. Again, it's involuntary, so our brains can't consciously control them. Short muscles, they also have one centrally located nucleus, so unlike your skeletal muscle, where the nucleus is pushed off to the side, your nuclei for your smooth muscle is in the center. Other way. One more. Okay. Forgot to mention about the cardiac muscle. So again, centrally located nucleus. And here in this little white portion around it is a glycogen storage. So it's a storage of your glucose molecules, making sure your cardiac muscle has the energy it needs at all times so that it can continuously pump. So in between our muscles, we have different types of cell junctions. So first type is, excuse me. So our first type is a tight junction, where you just have very little space in between the cells and you have these proteins that just help link to each other. Next type is the desmosomes. So you have these proteins, plaques that are attached to the cytoskeleton in the cell, and you have a little bit more space in between the cells. So showing kind of an example over here to create tight junctions. Or not tight junctions, but just linkage between the two cells. So tight junctions are down here, more towards the basal surface. Here at the bottom you have a hemidesmosome, so half of a desmosome. So instead of it having the same on the other side, it's just only half of it. The last specialized cell junction is a gap junction. So it kind of looks like an orange, so there's multiple proteins that make up this structure, and it helps with transport and communicating between your different cells. So I'm going a little bit into our gap junction. So multiple proteins make up a ring or channel in between the two cells. So here in this little hole, small solutes as well as other nutrients or ions can easily pass between the two cells. This type of junction is found in cardiac and smooth muscle as well as your embryonic tissue, so allowing for these to work and function better because you're easily able to pass things through just that little hole junction in between the cells. So in a lot of your tissues, you have glands to create a particular product. There's two major types of glands. You have your exocrine glands that will create a product that is moved to the external or outside surface of a tissue, so exo like exit. In order to move their product to the surface, it does so through a way of a duct. So your surfaces can be external, such as sweat and tears, or they can be internal. So for example, the pancreas or salivary glands dumping their product into a duct to get to the surface, more internal surface like your small intestines or into the mouth. The other type of gland is the endocrine gland. There are no ducts in these types of gland, but there's a lot of capillaries that are associated with these glands, and so they'll just secrete their product directly into the blood. Usually the product is a hormone. Hormones are chemical messengers, and they use the circulatory system as their transport system, so they can have long, wide-reaching effects around the body. Some organs both have a endocrine and exocrine function, so having both types of glands for their making of their particular product. So here's kind of a picture of our two gland types. Again, our endocrine, so let's go back first. This one was mentioned first. So exocrine glands here, so we're making our product and then sending it out through a duct. Endocrine glands are going to stay inside the body. Lots of capillaries that are associated with the gland, so those cells can just empty the product right into those capillaries, and then those hormones can then travel through the bloodstream. So with your exocrine glands, so these are going to move the product to the outside environment. There are 3 different types. So the first one are merocrine glands, apocrine glands, and holocrine glands. So the first type, merocrine glands, they use vesicles to transport their product to the outside surface of the cell, and then those vesicles will dock with the plasma membrane to release the product out into the duct system. So examples of this are our tear glands, some of the glands inside the pancreas, Glasha glands, and in this case, milk, sugar, and protein being released, part of the mammary glands inside the breast. So merocrine glands using vesicles to transport the product to the outside surface of the cell and release it. Your next type of gland are your apocrine glands. So apocrine glands usually have a product that's in lipid form, and instead of the product just being released into the aqueous environment, because they are lipids, they're going to need to be packaged. So in this type of secretion, the product is packaged into a vesicle on its way out from the cell. So for example, one of these is the axillary sweat gland. So axillary region being your armpit region, has this type of secretion, even though they also use the merocrine secretion mode for their product as well. So in your mammary glands, they also have this type of secretion. So milk, fat, lipid being secreted out in these vesicle packages. So if you ever see breast milk under a microscope, you're actually going to see these fat globules inside the milk. And then also adding, for example, the more watery secretions with the sugar and watery part of milk, using the merocrine type of secretion. The last type of secretion, usually for your oil glands, is holocrine secretion. So here near the top part of the glands, the cells are away from the basement membrane and they're going to eventually die off. As they die off, they also become part of the product. So the cells will eventually disintegrate and become part of the product. So you usually find these in your oil glands, in your scalp and skin, as well as some glands in your eyelids. So now we're going to take our different tissue types and combine them into different combinations and to create what's called a membrane. So your membranes can sometimes only have one tissue types, or they can have multiple tissue types. So examples of tissue types are, for example, only connective, the dura mater that surrounds the brain and spinal cord, the synovial membranes, as well as the periosteum that covers your bones. Some that are only epithelial tissue, part of the cornea and lens of the eye, so the more front surfaces of those two structures. So the largest membrane in the body is the cutaneous membrane, making up the skin. It's made up of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, so multiple layers, flat cells, and there's epithelial tissue, that's your epidermis of the skin. The dermis, which is below the basement membrane of the epidermis, is a layer of connective tissue. This tissue is relatively dry and serves to protect the body from the outside environment. Next type of membrane that I'm going to cover are your mucous membranes. So there's other membrane types, but I'm just going to just only focus on this one. So this one's a mucous membrane. So of course, mucous membrane, there's got to be some mucus somewhere. So here's our epithelial layer of tissue. So in this one, it's a pseudo-stratified columnar. So although it looks like they're all pushed and stacked on top of each other, everyone is going to touch that basement membrane. Also in this membrane, of course, in order to create the mucus, you need those goblet cells. So here's the goblet cells. So again, shaped kind of like a wine glass, making the mucus, and then that mucus floats on that saline layer with all these cilia structures that are inside that cilia layer, pushing the mucus in one direction. So below this epithelial tissue is the connective tissue, so having all the blood vessels to support this tissue, lots of structural support with your fibers, and then lastly, a lot of your white blood cells helping your immune system, so migrating through, making sure that, for example, if this were respiratory tract, let's say if you had a pathogen or some kind of like bacteria, something that's going to cause a disease, somehow make its way past the epithelial layer, then this layer is most likely going to catch it. The last layer in a mucous membrane is here at the bottom, a little smooth muscle layer down here at the bottom. So again, going through our mucous membrane, multiple layers, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and this one also having a muscle layer as well as part of this tissue. It's a mucous membrane, so it needs your mucus. Goblet cells are the one that's going to be creating that mucus and then creating the mucus and sending it out, and that floats on that saline layer above those cilia cell extensions. Sometimes our tissues get damaged, and so in order for them to repair themselves so they're no longer just allowing pathogens to go through or parts of our body to leak out, there's two different ways our tissues can repair, either through regeneration. So you're going to replace the damaged tissue cells with the same type of cell. So this restores its function, so you're going to have the same type of cell, you're still able to have the same function in that area that was damaged. The other type of tissue repair is fibrosis. So this is done through a scar tissue. So instead of replacing the cells that were damaged, the fibrosis type of tissue repair is just going to replace that damaged tissue with fibers. So it's no longer going to have its normal function because those cells are no longer there, but still able to hold that tissue back together. So for example, we have a very deep cut inside our skin, so going through our epidermis layer, going through our dermis layer, and cutting into a blood vessel. So when that blood vessel is cut, of course, blood's going to leak out. Eventually, you're going to form a scab up here. You're going to have your white blood cells migrating around to start cleaning up the damage. Your antibodies from the blood is going to move around. So just in case it runs up against a pathogen that the body has made an antibody against, then you're able to fight against a possible pathogen that it has migrated in. A few steps later, we're almost done completely healing the cut on our skin. Epidermis is starting to build and clear out the damaged tissue. So here we have our macrophages making room so the cells can start making new cells in that place. Down here in our deeper layer where our dermis is, there's a soft mass called a granulation tissue. So we have a lot of blood vessels going into that area, a lot of fibroblasts in there making new collagen. So instead of making new tissue to function the way it should, it's going to make the scar tissue. So once we are close to done healing, so we still have the scab on the outside, epidermis gone through regeneration, replacing the old damaged cells with new ones. And then down here in the dermis deeper layer where it's mostly just collagen fibers, creating a scar tissue, so a non-functioning type of tissue. Well, that's it for Chapter 5.